There are moments in American history when silence echoes louder than any speech, and on a cold afternoon inside the Capitol, one such moment unfolded, live, uncensored, and unforgettable. Former ICE Director Tom Homan, a man once seen as untouchable, sat face to face with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't pound the table. She simply held up a single piece of paper, the memo he thought would never see daylight. A memo that spelled out the machinery of family separation, signed in ink soaked in silence. And when she read it aloud, line by line, page by page, Homan said nothing, could say nothing. America watched as the man who once gave the orders now had no words to defend them. What you're about to witness is a dramatized retelling of that moment, a fictionalized reconstruction built on real events, real policies, and very real consequences. While names and records have been adapted for narrative clarity, the emotions, the stakes, and the moral questions are deeply rooted in truth. Because sometimes to understand the cost of silence, we have to hear it speak. The sound comes first, faint at first, then sharper, cutting through the stillness like glass splitting under pressure. It's not the sound of a siren or of chaos, it's worse. It's the thin, trembling cry of a child too young to form words, but old enough to feel fear. It wails, stops, gasps, and then starts again, over and over, each time smaller, weaker, as if even despair has its limits. We're inside an ICE detention center. The overhead fluorescent lights hum a low electric monotone, casting a sterile blue glow over the long rows of chain-link cages. They call them holding areas, but no American watching this would confuse them for anything other than what they are: metal pens. On the cold concrete floor, a mylar blanket reflects the light like foil, crinkled around a tiny, unmoving body. The child is no older than 3. She lies curled up in the corner, thumb in mouth, eyes wide open. She's not asleep. She's frozen. 2 agents pass by outside the cage, clipboards in hand. One of them mutters something about lunch rotations. Neither of them looks inside. The child stirs, reaches out through the fence, not screaming now, just mouthing words no one hears, and then her fingers retreat again. Just 20 feet away, separated by a wall, a woman kneels against another cage. Her face is blotched red from crying, hands clutching at the chain links. "Mi hija," she whispers. "Por favor, mi hija." Her voice is already hoarse. She doesn't know her daughter is just a few yards away. No one has told her. No one will. A metal door slams shut somewhere off screen, and that's when the voice of the narrator breaks in. Low, steady, almost mournful. What if this was your child? What if the system told you this was legal? That question doesn't go away. It hangs there, suspended like fog over a frozen battlefield. Because this isn't the past. This isn't history. This is now. This is policy. And the people who designed it didn't do it in secret or in haste. They signed their names at the bottom of a page. Somewhere on Capitol Hill, a folder is dropped on a desk. The camera doesn't show who it belongs to, not yet. All we see is the label in bold black type. April 23, 2018. Memo, prosecution of all amenable adults. There are 3 options listed in the document. Only one is underlined in red. Option 3, family separation. The narrator continues, they called it zero tolerance. But what do you call it when a child disappears into a cage and the paper trail is the only thing that remains? As the screen fades to black, we hear one final sound. The child's cry again, barely a whimper now, cut off by a metallic clang. And with that, the story begins. The cry faded. The silence took over. But some echoes don't disappear. They migrate. They settle in places like Capitol Hill, where policy wears a suit and the coldness of steel cages is replaced by the chill of fluorescent office lights and legalese. The camera in your mind moves now, not from border fences to prison pens, but to a high-ceiling room where words, not wire, do the cutting. A soft thud breaks the quiet. A manila folder drops onto Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's desk. She doesn't flinch, just reaches for it slowly, as if she already knows what it contains. The lighting here isn't much different from the detention center, really, just brighter, more polite. There are no children in sight, but in a way their absence feels heavier than their presence ever could. Her fingers undo the clasp. One page sticks up, already creased at the corner, like it's been opened before, like it's been read too many times by people who knew what it meant and looked away anyway. The memo is dated April 23, 2018, typed in dense black text, unsigned at the top, clinical, cold, until you scroll down. Her eyes land on the line, underlined, red ink. Option 3, family separation. AOC reads the words aloud, slowly, as if saying them out loud will make them less absurd, less cruel. But they only echo harder in the sterile quiet of her office. Her staffer, Maya, barely breathes as she leans forward. "This is the one," she whispers. "This is the beginning." And just like that, the room is no longer still. Not in her mind. Headlines rise up like ghosts. Border Patrol accused of separating families without warning. Children as young as 1 appear in immigration court alone. No record of reunification in over 1,400 cases. She remembers the hearings, the photos, the blanket wrapped around a toddler's feet like tinfoil. The way reporters couldn't get answers, only numbers. And the way the numbers never added up. But this memo isn't a number. It's not a photo. It's the plan. 3 options, each more severe than the last, and it's option 3 that carries the chosen mark. The staffer beside her reads along in silence, lips moving, but no sound. Her eyes don't leave the paragraph. AOC doesn't blink. This isn't just legal theory. This is state-sponsored trauma, drafted in bullet points. At the bottom of the memo, the signatures appear. One by one, familiar names. Names that once stood in front of flags and podiums, justifying everything with the phrase national security. Thomas D. Homan, Kevin McAleenan, Francis Cisna. They didn't just approve it, they recommended it. They offered it up like an idea in a boardroom, like a product proposal. Option 3, break the families, break the bond, break the line of dignity. AOC closes the folder gently, like something sacred has been violated and doesn't deserve to be touched. Her eyes narrow. She leans back in her chair, jaw clenched. "He signed it," she murmurs. "He signed it and walked away." Maya looks at her. "What do we do now?" There's no hesitation. "We bring it into the light." The echo from the detention center has traveled. It has crossed state lines, party lines, agency lines. It has left the chain link fences and landed here, in this folder, in this memo, in these hands. It is no longer a cry. It is now a question. And in the next room, in a hearing just days away, AOC intends to demand an answer. The room was quiet, almost deceptively so. The kind of quiet that only exists right before something breaks. Behind the double doors of the hearing chamber, final sound checks buzz softly from microphones as congressional aides adjusted nameplates and pitchers of water. But just beyond that space, in the narrow backstage hallway where concrete met politics, 2 stories were preparing to collide. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stood alone at the edge of a folding table, sleeves rolled just below her elbows, her fingers resting lightly on a yellow legal pad. Her pen had stopped moving. The questions were already written, neatly, precisely. But it wasn't the ink that held the power now. It was the silence. A silence charged with intention. Her voice was low as she read over each line, lips barely parting, as if repeating the rhythm in her mind would sharpen every syllable. One hand adjusted the stack of documents at her side, the memo now tucked neatly between pages of supporting material. No theatrics, no need. She didn't plan to raise her voice today. She didn't have to. The evidence would do that for her. Across the corridor, footsteps echoed, measured, heavy, deliberate. Tom Homan had arrived. He walked like a man who'd been here before, because he had. In hearing after hearing, he'd sat squarely before lawmakers and walked out untouched. He was used to the rhythm of politics, the predictable outrage, the practiced sound bites, the partisan applause that followed. Today he expected no different. His jacket fit perfectly, his expression unreadable but smug around the eyes. He was a man convinced of his own correctness. He didn't carry a briefcase. He didn't need one. His armor wasn't in paper but in posture, the kind that says, I've answered harder questions, I've survived louder critics. But across the hall, AOC wasn't preparing for loud. She was preparing for surgical. Inside her folder, option 3 waited quietly, like a knife wrapped in cloth. Its edge had already been tested, and she knew exactly where to strike. She had rehearsed the questions, but not the answers. Those would come, and they would either break or reveal him. She heard the commotion now, the subtle shift in sound that follows when someone important enters the building, but she didn't look up. Instead, she whispered something to her aide, then tucked the legal pad under her arm. Her face stayed still, but her eyes burned. The hallway remained cold, clinical. Outside, the news vans were already circling the Capitol, satellite dishes pivoting toward the sky. A handful of journalists loitered by the entrance, waiting for quotes, not knowing they were minutes away from history. And in that final breath before the hearing began, the narrator returned. Not loud, not dramatic, just clear. One of them carries a document, the other carries a truth, and today, in front of the American people, only one will leave untouched. The doorknob turned, the hearing room opened, and the storm began. The chair's gavel tapped twice, a hollow wooden sound that brought the hearing room to attention. The cameras rolled, the reporters shifted in their seats, and somewhere in the background, someone clicked a pen nervously. Tom Homan sat with his hands clasped on the table, spine straight, chin slightly raised. He was already in posture, already in form. But across from him, Alexandria Ocasio-cortez was not performing. She was about to begin something far less theatrical and far more dangerous. She adjusted her microphone, not for effect, but to be sure her voice would cut through the noise cleanly. Then, without preamble, without rhetorical flourishes, she began. According to the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, she said evenly, family unity is a fundamental right under international law. That includes families seeking asylum at national borders, even those crossing irregularly. There was no reaction from the panel. Not yet. She continued, tone steady, clinical. The United States, as a member of the UN, is a signatory to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and has committed to respecting family unity as a legal and moral obligation. A pause, then she looked up, gaze sweeping across the long table of witnesses seated before her. Officials, former appointees, legal scholars. Her voice did not rise, but it tightened with purpose. I'd like to ask the panel one question before we proceed, she said. A simple one. She looked at each of them in turn. Her eyes stopped at Tom Homan's face for just a second longer than the rest. He blinked but said nothing. Can any of you, she asked, raise your hand right now? On the record, if you believe family separation is an effective or legitimate deterrent to illegal immigration? The silence came immediately. No shifting in seats, no coughs, just stillness. It stretched past the point of comfort. 1 second, 2, 5. Homan kept his hands folded tightly together. The legal scholar to his left stared forward. Another official glanced downward as if something fascinating had suddenly appeared in their notes. But not a single hand moved. AOC didn't fill the space. She let it breathe, let the weight of the silence settle into the room like dust on polished mahogany. She wanted the moment to linger, not as theater, but as testimony. Let the record show, she finally said with quiet firmness, that not one person on this panel was willing to publicly defend family separation as a legitimate deterrent. Not one. Her words didn't echo, but they didn't need to. They landed with weight, the type of weight that no one wants to carry, and no one can throw off once it's been placed squarely in front of them. Tom Homan shifted slightly in his chair. His expression didn't change, but his grip on his wrist tightened. AOC turned back to her notes, calm as ever. That was the first blow, not loud, not dramatic, but clean, precise, and undeniable. And everyone in that room felt it. The silence from the panel still lingered in the air like a haze, as if the walls themselves had absorbed it. But AOC wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. She had only begun to peel back the layers. And now, with the weight of their non-response hanging over the room like fog over water, she turned the page in her binder, slowly, deliberately. "Mr. Chairman," she said, her tone unchanging, "I would like to enter into the congressional record a memorandum dated April 23rd, 2018. She held it up just enough so the camera would catch it, not as a showpiece but as evidence. The top page was crisp, bearing the seal of the Department of Homeland Security in the upper corner. Beneath it, in bold lettering, Memorandum for the Secretary. Subject, Increasing Prosecution of Immigration Violations. She let the silence settle for a beat, then began to read. Signed by Mr. Tom Homan, Kevin McAleenan, and Francis Cisna. This memo laid out 3 options for increasing immigration enforcement. The third and recommended option included family separation as a core strategy. Across the room, Homan shifted in his chair. His jaw tensed ever so slightly. AOC didn't glance at him. She didn't need to. Her focus was the document, the facts, not the man. The memo states, she continued, this initiative would pursue prosecution of all amenable adults who cross our border illegally, including those presenting with a family unit. She looked up now, eyes meeting his. Mr. Homan, she said evenly, this memo was signed by you. Do you dispute its authenticity? He cleared his throat before answering. I don't dispute that I signed it, he said carefully. But we gave options. That's all. Multiple options. I didn't create the policy. That decision came from higher up. AOC didn't blink. But you recommended option 3, correct? We presented the options, yes, he replied, his voice growing firmer. And option 3 was one of them. She leaned forward slightly, not aggressively, just enough to close the space between the facts and the man. Mr. Homan, the memo doesn't list all 3 options as equal. It explicitly recommends option 3. And your name is on that recommendation. Are you saying that recommendation wasn't yours? He hesitated now. I'm saying I didn't make final policy. That's not what I do. But you offered it. You suggested it. You signed your name to it. That is on record. He didn't respond. AOC turned a page. Let me read further. The department should refer for prosecution all amenable adults apprehended crossing the border, including those part of family units. That's a direct quote. Another pause, this one deeper. The kind of pause where a witness realizes they are no longer responding to a lawmaker, but to a history that will not be kind. AOC looked at the chairman. Again, I'd like to formally submit this memo for the record. No objection, the chairman replied. She returned to Homan. When you signed this, did you consider what it meant for the children involved? Did you consider that your signature could become the first link in a chain that led to trauma, litigation, and in some cases, lifelong separation? He didn't answer immediately. We considered the implications, he said eventually, but our duty was to enforce the law. AOC nodded, slowly, almost sadly. And yet not a single person on this panel would raise their hand to defend the result of that enforcement. Then she closed the memo, and in doing so opened something far more difficult to shut, the question of accountability. The memo lay flat on the table now, its clean lines and bureaucratic phrasing still echoing in the minds of those watching. But Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was done with documents. She'd shown the architecture. Now it was time to show the aftermath, the damage rendered in the lives of those whose names would never make it onto official records. She turned away from the panel, away from the polished wood and brass fixtures, and faced the audience. Not just the room, but the country. Her eyes met the lens of the broadcast camera as if it were a living thing, and her voice, still calm, dropped into something deeper, steadier, heavier. This isn't about politics, she said plainly. This is about children. No dramatics, no finger-pointing, just truth, offered with a gravity that made even the low hum of air conditioning seem suddenly intrusive. She reached down and lifted another folder, this one thinner, more fragile. Inside were not policy memos or legal opinions. They were letters, testimonies, words scrawled in Spanish and translated line by line. She pulled one out, unfolded it with care. This letter is from a mother named Gabriela, she said. She was separated from her 6-year-old daughter at a border processing center in Texas. They told her she would see her child again in a few days. That was in 2018. She has not seen her daughter since. She read from the page, each word like a pin driven into the stillness. I asked them where she was. They told me they didn't know. They told me I had no right to ask anymore because I was no longer her guardian. I gave birth to her. I held her when she had fevers, and they told me I had no right to her. A soft gasp escaped from the audience. Someone covered their mouth. A man in the second row, wearing a navy blazer and a pin of the U.S. flag, clenched his jaw visibly. AOC didn't pause. She read another. My son was taken while I was in another room being processed. When I asked where he went, they said he had already been flown to another state. They said I'd be notified later. I was never notified. She folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the folder. These are not hypothetical, she said. These are not fringe cases or clerical errors. These were choices, systematic, deliberate choices. Her voice did not tremble, but it weighed more with every word. And if we are to be a nation that calls itself just, that claims to value family, faith, and freedom, then we must ask ourselves, what do we call this? She didn't wait for an answer. There wasn't one that could satisfy the moment. The camera panned the room. Faces were locked in place, expressions etched with quiet disbelief. A woman in the back wiped a tear discreetly with her sleeve. One of the aides seated behind the chairman looked down, avoiding eye contact with the front. And somewhere in that suspended moment, the narrator's voice returned, not to explain, but to witness. She wasn't just speaking, she was indicting, not just the man before her, but the system that made him feel invincible. And in that courtroom without walls, morality was the only judge. The hearing had only begun, but already the real verdict had started to form. One not of guilt or innocence, but of conscience. The room had turned. You could feel it. What began as quiet discomfort was slowly sharpening into tension, like the slow twist of a dial towards something volatile. AOC's calm cadence had carried weight, but it was now Homan's turn to respond, and he didn't plan on sitting quietly. He leaned forward, voice taut with practiced authority, the kind that came from years of defending tough policies in tougher rooms. Let me be clear, he began, looking past AOC toward the committee, as if appealing to a wider logic. When you break the law in this country, any law, there are consequences. That includes separation. If you're arrested for DUI and you've got your kid in the car, you don't go to jail with the child. You get separated. It's standard law enforcement procedure. The words were crisp, confident, calculated to reset the frame. Recast the cruelty as order. Recast the cages as consequence. But before the last syllable had even settled in the air, AOC was already speaking. No, she said sharply. That is not the same. Homan blinked. She didn't raise her voice. But now, for the first time, it cut. Seeking asylum is not breaking the law, she said. It is not a DUI. It is not theft. It is not a violent crime. It is a protected legal right under both U.S. and international law. He opened his mouth, but she kept going, voice steady, pressing in. You are comparing a desperate parent, fleeing persecution with a child in their arms, to someone endangering lives by driving drunk? Homan began to shake his head, but the spark had already caught flame. The energy in the room changed. It didn't explode, but it tightened. The staffers in the back stiffened. A few journalists leaned in, sensing the shift. Even the chairman seemed suddenly alert, as though the hearing had moved into a different register altogether. Homan straightened his posture, tried to recover. The law is the law, he said firmly. Crossing the border illegally is still a violation of 8 U.S. Code 1325. That's a misdemeanor. When you violate that code, you are subject to prosecution. And asylum seekers are permitted to present themselves between ports of entry, AOC countered. That has been recognized in our legal system for decades. You know that. And yet your policy lumped them in with criminal offenders. You treated their presence as a threat rather than a plea for protection. He shifted again, this time visibly uncomfortable. They were still subject to legal processing. At what cost, she shot back. To what end? You can quote statutes, Mr. Homan, but none of them required separating toddlers from their mothers without any clear path to reunification. That wasn't law enforcement. That was trauma by design. That word, trauma, hung in the room like a smoke alarm no one could turn off. For a second, Homan had nothing. He looked at the table, at the edge of his prepared notes. His fingers tapped lightly against the wood, but there was no line strong enough to undo what had just been said. AOC leaned back, just slightly. She didn't need to say more. She had drawn the line, forced the choice, between law and justice, between process and humanity. And for a brief, unmistakable moment, the spin machine stalled, not broken, not dismantled, but jammed undeniably in full view of the American people. The tension in the room hadn't eased. It had settled deeper, quieter, heavier, the kind of silence that doesn't invite peace, but holds its breath, waiting. Homan sat stiffer now, his earlier confidence replaced by a wariness that showed in the small things. The fingers gripping the edge of the table, the eyes flicking toward the clock, the way he no longer leaned forward when he spoke. AOC, by contrast, seemed more composed than ever. Not calmer, she had always been calm, but sharper, as if clarity was its own form of pressure. She reached again for the April 23rd memo, the same manila-colored document that had quietly haunted the first half of the hearing. She held it like evidence, not argument, and she began flipping through it, page by page. "Your name," she said, eyes scanning the sheet, "appears here." She turned to the next page. "And here." Another page. Her tone didn't rise, but the repetition carried weight. "And here." She looked up now, her gaze level, unwavering. "It's on the cover memo. It's in the recommendations. It's in the signature block. That's 3 different places where you signed off on a policy that resulted in children being taken from their parents." Homan shifted in his seat. "I didn't author the memo," he said, voice measured. "I signed it, yes, but I wasn't the author. It was a joint effort between departments. We gave the secretary multiple enforcement options." "But you signed the recommendation," she said. "Yes." "You endorsed the content." "Yes." "Then how is authorship the defense?" Homan paused. "Because decisions were made above my level." AOC leaned slightly forward, no more than a few inches, but enough to send the message. "So let me ask you plainly, Mr. Homan, if not you, then who? If the man who signed the memo isn't responsible, is it the desk that printed it? The intern who formatted the bullet points? Who do we blame? The pen or the hand that held it?" The words were quiet, but they landed hard. Some in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. Even the committee members, long practiced in the stoic expression, showed signs of unease. There was no yelling, no gavel banging, just the sharp weight of accountability slowly tightening around a man who had long operated just outside its reach. Homan cleared his throat. "The policy came from the top," he repeated. "The department, the White House. I didn't have unilateral authority." "Yet your name is on every page," she said. "And those children? Their names are on none." For a moment he said nothing. The silence stretched again, not because of shock this time, but because there was nowhere for his answer to land that wouldn't fracture further. AOC closed the memo gently and placed it back on the desk in front of her. "I'm not here to argue whether the policy was effective," she said. "I'm here to ask whether it was human." Homan didn't respond. Because some questions aren't about answers. They're about making sure the silence becomes part of the record too. The room remained still, though everything in it had shifted. The weight of responsibility had settled like dust, visible but untouched, and Tom Homan now sat under it, stoic but cracked around the edges. Alexandria Ocasio-cortez didn't lean on drama or volume. She leaned on something far more difficult to ignore. The truth written in plain, institutional language, delivered with the unshakable steadiness of someone who had read every line and understood exactly what it had cost. She rested her hand gently on the memo, the pages still open but untouched. Her eyes scanned the panel again, then turned briefly toward the audience and the cameras beyond. "When cruelty is written in memo form," she began, her voice calm but unmistakably cold, "it doesn't feel like violence." There was no objection, no shifting, just the low mechanical hum of the ceiling lights and the shallow breathing of those in the room. "It comes in bullet points, numbered options, neutral language. It gets printed on clean paper, passed through departments, initialed at the margins, stamped, dated, filed. It doesn't scream. It doesn't bleed." She paused, letting that image settle. But it is violence. It's just been disguised. Her words didn't rise, but they deepened, pulled down by the gravity of what they pointed to. This wasn't improvisation. This was a statement refined through rage and grief, polished by sleepless nights and stories that wouldn't leave her alone. Let's not pretend this was chaos, she continued. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a breakdown. This was procedure. It was processed, signed, approved. And then her voice sharpened just slightly. Not a yell, but the kind of tone that made the listener sit up straighter. This wasn't enforcement. It was engineered trauma. She let it hang there. She didn't need to say more. But what followed wasn't her voice. It was the quiet echo of what the nation had already seen. Gabriella, the mother whose daughter vanished after intake. Diego, age 4, sobbing into a translation headset during his immigration hearing. A teenage girl describing how the guards told her to stop crying or she'd be put in isolation. Footage of chain-link cages. Thermal images of crowded rooms. Audio clips of children wailing for parents who had already been deported. It all played out, not on a screen, but in the minds of those who had followed the headlines and convinced themselves that outrage was enough. It wasn't. It never had been. And through it all, the bureaucratic language remained. Amenable adults. Expedited removal. Zero tolerance. AOC lowered her gaze to the document one final time. You can wrap it in legal language. You can hide it under policy, but cruelty does not lose its nature because it has a letterhead. Homan looked up, but his eyes didn't challenge her anymore. They just searched for something else to rest on. Something that didn't remind him of what this was. Because once you've seen it clearly, there's no going back. The system hadn't malfunctioned. It had functioned exactly as intended. And now in this room, under oath and on record, that design had finally been named. The air in the hearing room had taken on a different texture, thicker somehow, like it resisted movement. The words AOC had just spoken still lingered, not loud, but undeniable. Engineered trauma. They weren't political rhetoric. They were a diagnosis. And now she was ready to show the X-ray, the exact fracture where morality had been surgically removed. She picked up the memo again, this time more slowly, almost ceremonially. Her fingertips hovered over the creased edge before she unfolded the page and flattened it against the desk. Her voice didn't waver, but there was a weight behind it now, like she was no longer just addressing a hearing, but bearing witness on behalf of those who couldn't be in the room. I'd like to read, for the record, a key paragraph from the April 23, 2018 memorandum submitted by Mr. Homan and others to the Secretary of Homeland Security, she said. She adjusted her glasses and glanced down. Quote, this initiative would pursue prosecution of all amenable adults who cross our border illegally, including those with family units. End quote. There it was. No adjectives, no emotion, just the line. One sentence written in a government memo that had unleashed a cascade of separations, hearings, lost children, and years of trauma that no policy reversal could ever fully undo. The room reacted before Homan did. A murmur rippled near the back of the chamber, barely audible but unmistakable. It wasn't outrage. It was realization. That line, read in full context, said everything. Homan's face tightened, his jaw locking ever so slightly. He didn't move, didn't speak, but his posture changed. The usual confidence in his body language gave way to something else. An internal calculation, a flicker of unease behind the stoicism. He knew that line. He remembered writing it, or at least approving it, but he had never expected it to be read like this, in a room that had finally run out of euphemisms. AOC didn't look at him yet. She was still reading. This sentence, she said, holding the page up just slightly so the cameras could see it, is where the pain began. It's where policy crossed the threshold from enforcement to deliberate cruelty. Now she turned to him. Mr. Homan, you recommended this initiative. You supported this language. Are you still comfortable with this phrasing, knowing what came after? He shifted, exhaled through his nose. As I've said before, we presented options. Enforcement decisions were made above me. She didn't blink. But this line wasn't theoretical. It was activated. It became action. Real families were pulled apart based on the framework you outlined right here. He nodded once and stiffly. That was the policy. And do you accept that the policy, as written and as implemented, inflicted long-term harm on thousands of children? He paused. I accept that it had consequences, he said finally. Consequences, she repeated. A convenient word. But when you follow the line from this memo to the detention centers, to the missing children, to the families still unreunited, it stops being an abstract. It becomes a chain, and every chain has a link. Her eyes stayed fixed on him now, no longer just questioning, but insisting. This was one of them. No one in the room argued, because no one could. The line had been read, and once read aloud, it could no longer be unseen. If the previous paragraph was the match, then what followed was the fuel. AOC, still seated but fully in control of the room, turned back to the memo, this time not just to quote it, but to dismantle it. With the same care one might use to unthread dangerous wiring, she unfolded the policy options section, slowly and deliberately. She wasn't rushing. She wanted every word to land. In this memorandum, she began, 3 policy options were outlined to increase immigration prosecutions. Option 1 focused on maintaining current practices while enhancing court capacity. Option 2 suggested limited prosecution of adults without dependents. And Option 3, she paused, giving the room a heartbeat to brace itself, recommended full-scale prosecution of all amenable adults, including those with children, knowing this would result in family separation. She let that settle, then raised her eyes. So my question is this. Why wasn't Option 1 or 2 chosen? Why wasn't family preservation prioritized? Tom Homan didn't answer immediately. His hands clasped tightly in front of him. He looked down for a moment, as if hoping the question would evaporate if given enough time. When he finally spoke, the response was as hollow as it was predictable. We thought Option 3 would be the most effective deterrent, he said, careful not to inflect too much meaning into any one word. AOC tilted her head slightly. Effective, she repeated. Deterrent. Then she nodded once, as if confirming something quietly for herself. So the goal wasn't just prosecution. It wasn't just policy compliance. It was fear. Homan opened his mouth to respond, but she didn't give him the space. Not this time. Let's call this what it is, she said, her voice clear and increasingly resolute. You reviewed 3 options. 1 maintained the dignity of families. 1 aimed for a narrow scope, and 1 guaranteed trauma. You chose the one that hurt people on purpose, because you believed that would send a message. He frowned. We believed it would discourage illegal entry, yes. And in the process, she pressed, you normalized institutional cruelty. You wrote it into the bureaucratic bloodstream of federal policy. And now, years later, you're still defending it on the basis that it might have worked. Her hands were still now resting on the document like a surgeon about to close the wound. Mr. Homan, effective cruelty doesn't make it moral. It makes it efficient. That's not a defense. That's an indictment. The word indictment rang out like a quiet hammer blow, more final than any gavel. He shifted again, visibly uncomfortable but unwilling to retreat. We enforce the law, he said, doubling down. That's what law enforcement does. It's not always pleasant. No, AOC replied calmly. But law enforcement should never be designed to traumatize children to make a political point. That's not just unpleasant. That's inhumane. She opened the memo again and gestured gently to the 3 options printed on the page. Option 1 would have preserved families. Option 2 would have targeted repeat adult crossers. Only Option 3 weaponized children as collateral. A moment passed. She didn't have to raise her voice. The weight of her words did the work. And the one you chose, she said, tapping her finger once on the page, is the only one signed and underlined. No one corrected her. No one objected. Because even in the cold language of policy, the choice had already spoken. The weight of the memo lingered, pages now worn slightly at the corners from being handled again and again. Read, quoted, dissected. But Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez wasn't finished with the record. The memo had revealed the architecture of the policy. Now she intended to submit the aftermath. She reached into a new folder, this one different from the others. Thinner, yes, but more human. It wasn't filled with policy options or legal strategy. It was a collection of names, faces, desperation written in careful handwriting, translated affidavits, and signed declarations. Mr. Chairman, AOC said, turning briefly to the committee's lead, I'd like to submit the following documents for the record. There was a rustle of paper as she listed them aloud. First, a sworn affidavit from Lucia Ramirez, whose son was taken from her at a processing center in El Paso and deported to Honduras alone. She has not been able to locate him since 2018. Second, a testimony from attorney Samuel Delgado, legal counsel for a coalition of family reunification advocates, who describes a complete collapse of tracking mechanisms across ICE and CBP detention centers. Third, a statement issued by UNICEF, dated July 2019, condemning the U.S. family separation policy as a deliberate violation of children's rights with no clear path to repair the psychological harm inflicted. She paused after that one, letting the quote settle. Fourth, a joint letter from representatives of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and the United Nations Human Rights Council, urging the United States to immediately cease the practice and to initiate a public accountability process for those responsible. The chairman nodded solemnly. Without objection, all documents are accepted into the record. AOC closed the folder gently and set her hands flat on the table. She didn't look at Homan right away. Instead, she spoke to the room, her voice measured and low, like someone trying not to disturb the gravity of a funeral. These are not stories from fringe actors or foreign critics. These are voices from inside the system, from lawyers, mothers, international watchdogs, and human rights organizations. They all point to the same conclusion, that what happened was not an accident. It was not a misunderstanding. It was a choice, and that choice caused irreparable harm to thousands of families. Now she turned, finally, back to Homan. Her tone sharpened slightly, not harsh, but unmistakably direct. So I'm going to ask you one final question, Mr. Homan. He looked at her, face unreadable. She asked it simply. If you had the chance to sign that memo again, knowing what it led to, knowing what you know now, would you do it? The room fell silent. Homan's lips parted, but no sound came. He looked briefly down at the table, then back at her. His fingers twitched, then stilled. It was only a second, 2 at most, but it felt longer, too long. The kind of silence that carries meaning no answer can clean up. He didn't speak. AOC didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just looked at him one last time and then faced forward. That, she said quietly, is also going into the record. And in that moment, silence spoke louder than any justification ever could. The silence that followed AOC's final question had a different weight to it now. No longer just the absence of speech, but something closer to reverence. No one dared fill the void. Not the chairman, not the panelists, not even the rustling reporters in the gallery. It was as if the entire room had paused, realizing it had crossed some invisible threshold between policy and pain. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez opened a final folder. This one wasn't official. It didn't carry a DHS seal or a timestamp from any federal agency. There were no bullet points or signature blocks. It was a single letter, handwritten in neat, looping script on lined paper, creased, folded, and unfolded so many times it was beginning to tear at the edges. She unfolded it slowly, treating it with more care than any other document so far. And then she began to read. This is a letter from Luz Maria, she said quietly. She was detained in Arizona in June 2018. Her daughter, age 5, was separated from her at the processing center and later deported to Guatemala without her knowledge. AOC's voice softened, not from uncertainty, but from a place of deep intentionality, an awareness that she was not reading policy anymore. She was reading grief. I still don't know what time they took her. I was told I had to fill out a form first. When I came back, she was gone. They told me she would be at a shelter. They didn't say where. AOC looked up for just a moment, scanning the room. No one moved. They said not to cry in front of the officers. It would make things harder. But I couldn't stop. I didn't eat for 2 days. Every time I asked about her, they said they were working on it. Her hands held the letter gently, fingers tracing the ink like it was something fragile. I dream about her crying. Sometimes I can see the pink shoes she wore when we crossed. She was holding my hand. She said her feet hurt, and I carried her. I think about that all the time in here." AOC paused just for a second, then finished the line. "But I'm not allowed to cry in detention." By now, even the most stoic faces had changed. One of the Republican members shifted uncomfortably in his seat. A staffer behind the panel lowered her gaze, eyes glistening. No one checked their phones. No one shuffled their papers. The silence wasn't procedural anymore. It was personal. "This letter," AOC continued, folding it gently and returning it to its envelope, "was not part of any case file. It was passed to a pro bono attorney by hand after Luz Maria had already been detained for 7 weeks. She has not seen her daughter since. There is no record of reunification, no clear timeline. No one from DHS has provided her with a photo, a location, or a legal pathway forward." She didn't need to say what that meant. The implications filled the space without being spoken. "She is one of hundreds," AOC added. "Not a number, not a footnote, not an exception." For a moment, the hearing room, so often defined by partisan combat, felt more like a courtroom, or perhaps a church. No raised voices, no crossfire, just the raw, unanswerable ache of a mother's unanswered letter. And no policy in the world could make that sound less like injustice. The letter from Luz Maria still lingered in the air like incense, its ache not yet settled, its questions still unanswered. But Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez knew that grief alone wouldn't be enough to move systems. Systems didn't cry. They responded to documents, to records, to gaps that couldn't be filled with excuses. And so, with that same calm intensity, she shifted her focus, not to another mother, but to the system itself. Her tone didn't rise, but her cadence changed. More clipped now, more surgical. "I'd like to direct my next question to Inspector General Costello," she said. The man adjusted his glasses and leaned toward his microphone, visibly bracing himself. A longtime career official within the Department of Homeland Security, he had the posture of someone who'd been trained to say little and reveal less. "Can you confirm," AOC began, "whether DHS maintains comprehensive medical records for pregnant detainees held in ICE or CBP custody?" Costello hesitated, as if calculating how much honesty the room would tolerate. "To my knowledge," he said, choosing his words carefully, "those facilities keep standard custody logs and incident reports. But as for centralized medical tracking specific to pregnant individuals, I'm not personally aware of any such system in place." AOC stared at him for a long second. "You're not aware," she repeated. "So we know where to put someone's wristband, but not whether they're pregnant?" Costello's expression remained neutral, but a subtle tension crept into his shoulders. "We rely on intake procedures and contracted medical professionals to—" She cut in, softly but firmly. "Let me rephrase the question, Mr. Costello. Where would I find a list right now of detainees who were pregnant at the time of their processing in ICE custody between 2018 and 2019? He blinked. "I don't believe such a list exists." There it was. AOC let the statement hover, not to shame him, but to spotlight the vacuum that had become standard operating procedure. "You were aware enough to separate families," she said, each word pronounced with unmistakable clarity, "but not enough to protect lives?" Costello didn't answer, not because he couldn't, but because there was nothing defensible left to offer. He knew it. Everyone in the room knew it. AOC continued, "In the past 6 months alone, we've received at least 7 reports of miscarriages occurring in custody. Most of them lack follow-up care. Several of them involve detainees placed in stress conditions for extended hours. Cold rooms, poor bedding, no prenatal vitamins." She pulled out a thin report, only a few pages long. "This is a physician's review of one such case. The woman, listed only as AD for anonymity, reported cramping for over a week before anyone documented her symptoms. By the time a nurse examined her, she had already lost the pregnancy." Her voice did not crack, but the pain within it was unmistakable. "These are not footnotes. These are lives. And if your agency cannot track the most basic markers of health among the most vulnerable people in your care, then what exactly are you tracking?" Costello lowered his eyes. "I'll take that back to the department. AOC nodded once. Please do, and let them know this committee is tracking it now too. The statement wasn't a threat, it was a promise. Because in the absence of paper trails, someone had to remember the names. The final report slipped back into the folder with a quiet shuffle, but its echoes were anything but silent. AOC had shown the rawest wounds, letters from mothers, absent medical records, ignored symptoms, unanswered cries. The testimony wasn't abstract anymore. It was intimate, human, painful. And yet the deeper she went, the more one truth became impossible to ignore. None of this was accidental. She sat straighter now, not out of defiance, but clarity. There was no more evidence to present, no more memos to unearth. Only the conclusion remained. I want to be very clear, she said, her voice even, steady. The cruelty wasn't the mistake. Her gaze swept the room once more. She didn't need to gesture. The silence belonged to her now. It was the point. The words landed with weight, not shouted, not embellished. They were factual. They were earned. Tom Homan shifted in his seat again, the first visible sign of real discomfort since the hearing began. A muscle along his jaw tightened. His eyes darted, not defiantly, but restlessly. The usual armor of authority he wore in these settings had thinned. AOC didn't look at him this time. She didn't have to. We've heard again and again that the system was overwhelmed. That chaos got the better of our institutions. That mistakes were made. She paused. But you don't write memos for chaos. You don't sign detailed policy options into law for accidents. You don't create a strategy paper that outlines how to separate families, how to target parents crossing with children, if all you're trying to do is cope with overflow. She leaned forward slightly, her voice still calm but harder at the edges. This wasn't about systems breaking. It was about systems designed to break people. Homan exhaled audibly, a sound halfway between impatience and resignation. His hands rested motionless on the table now, no longer gripping, no longer controlling anything. AOC continued. You see, a broken system forgets. It misplaces. It loses track. But this system didn't forget the memo. It didn't forget the order. It didn't forget to separate the families. It only forgot to reunite them. Now she turned finally to Homan, just her eyes sharp and unwavering. You followed the paper trail all the way to the edge of a cage and stopped there. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Not right away. AOC held the pause like a thread pulled tight. You helped design a machine that could process people faster than it could feel. And now that the outcomes are undeniable, now that the cries have reached even the people who didn't want to hear them, you want us to believe it was a policy misfire. Another pause. It wasn't, she said softly. The room didn't flinch, but the emotional tone had cracked open. Staffers averted their eyes. One of the witnesses further down the panel shifted a notepad to cover their expression. Even members of the opposing party were still. No rebuttal, no rescue. Homan looked down again, this time not to avoid the question, but because he had none left to offer. And in that moment, the system, so often defended by process and paper, was revealed for what it was, not broken, but inhuman by design. There are moments when even the most hardened rooms forget how to breathe. What came before had already shaken the hearing. Mothers lost in the system, pregnancies ignored, cruelty institutionalized. But now AOC reached for something smaller, not in meaning, never in meaning, but in scale. And the entire room seemed to sense what was coming before she even said a word. She picked up a single photograph from the folder in front of her. No memo, no affidavit, just an image printed on plain cardstock. No frame, no border. She didn't hold it up yet, not right away. First, she looked at it. For a long moment, she said nothing. Her thumb brushed the edge of the paper gently. Then, without drama, she lifted the photo just above the desk and turned it so the rest of the room could see. This child's name, she said softly, is Maria Isabel. The image was grainy, like it had been printed from a scanned phone photo. But the girl was unmistakably real. 18 months old, hair wispy and unkempt, her wide eyes framed by soft cheeks and a fragile expression. somewhere between confusion and curiosity. She wore a simple dress and one mismatched shoe. She was detained with her mother in Dilley, Texas. AOC continued. This photo was taken shortly before her illness began. She developed a respiratory infection after being held for several days in a facility where the temperature dropped below 60 degrees at night. Medical care was delayed. Documentation was inconsistent. She died in custody. She turned the photo slightly and read from the back. Date of birth, July 14th, 2017. Date of death, August 30th, 2018. A beat passed, 1 second, 2, and in that stillness, a strange collective instinct emerged. People leaned forward, squinting, not to read the words, but to confirm they hadn't misheard. 47 days, that was all. 47 days between being processed by the U.S. government and being buried under American soil in a borrowed grave, her mother not even allowed to choose the casket. AOC didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She was not a threat. She was not a number. She was not a policy challenge. Her eyes moved slowly across the room. She was a baby. There it was, the word that makes policy feel like blasphemy. Not a child, a baby. Tom Homan shifted again, his posture collapsing slightly, not from fatigue, but from pressure. His hands, once rigid, now rested limp against his lap. No part of his expression suggested he was unmoved, but neither could he meet her gaze. AOC set the photo down gently in front of her, as if placing a nameplate at a table that had forgotten one of its own. She never got a court hearing. She never got a case number. She didn't even get a medical record that followed her across facilities. What she got was forgotten. Her words weren't angry. They were cold in the way that truth is when it no longer needs embellishment. The system that let her die, she said, still exists. The policies may change, the headlines may fade, but the structure, the indifference, it remains, unless we name it, unless we look it in the face. She looked again at the photo. Her name was Maria Isabel, and she mattered. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the distant hum of the lights seemed to dull, because for that moment, the youngest victim was in the room, and no one, not even her government, could look away. The photo of Maria Isabel remained on the table, unmoving, undeniable. It faced no camera, no committee member directly, but it faced everyone all at once. Her presence, once erased from the system, now hovered over it like an accusation no one could answer. And that was exactly where Alexandria Ocasio-cortez turned next. She didn't reach for another folder. She didn't need more evidence. She leaned forward, voice lower, tighter, stripped of everything but purpose. I'd like to ask a very simple question, she said, eyes scanning the panel. Where is her file? She let the question hang. Where is Maria Isabel's medical record? Where is her transfer order? Where is the document showing who authorized the delay in her treatment? Who checked her temperature? Who signed the form that allowed a sick infant to be shuffled between cold holding cells like an inventory item? There was no answer. Not right away. Not from Tom Homan. Not from the DHS representative. Not from anyone. AOC waited, letting the silence do what no argument could, make its own case. She asked again, softer this time. Who was accountable? Still, nothing. Even the chairman shifted in his seat now, visibly uneasy. A quiet cough came from somewhere in the back of the room, but it didn't break the weight of the pause. It only emphasized it. We have, AOC said finally, a signed memo recommending prosecution of every adult who crosses the border, including those with children. That memo had 3 signatures. She tapped the table once, not in anger, but to anchor her point. We have signatures for policy, for strategy, for enforcement. Then her voice dropped lower, barely above a whisper. But we don't have a single signed release form for a human life. The words didn't need to rise to thunder to shake the room. They landed with a different kind of force, the kind that brings a courtroom to its knees, the kind that wipes out spin and replaces it with silence. Tom Homan didn't speak. His hands had moved from resting on his knees to folded tightly in front of him, elbows locked. He looked like a man sitting through a funeral in which he didn't know the deceased, but somehow understood the role he played. AOC continued, her voice a thread of steel wrapped in calm. Maria Isabel died under our custody. She was 18 months old, and the government who processed her never closed the file because the file was never fully opened. She looked once more at the panel. If she had been a shipment of goods, we would have had a tracking number. If she had been evidence in a criminal case, we'd know the chain of custody. But because she was a baby, poor, migrant, voiceless, she passed through a system that treated her like a shadow. She picked up the photo again, not to wave it, but to keep it visible. We built a process with procedures for everything, except grief, except humanity, except responsibility. She paused, then looked each member of the panel in the eye. And now, even in death, she remains undocumented. The silence that followed wasn't procedural. It was a confession no one had the courage to say out loud. The photo of Maria Isabel rested between two glasses of water on the witness table, more present than any of the officials sitting under oath. Her silence had said what the policies tried to hide. Her absence had become the room's center of gravity. And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, her posture still composed, returned her focus to the document that had started it all. The April 23rd memo sat on the table like a ghost in paper form, its language too clean to reflect its consequences. For most, it was just text, pages typed, signed, filed. But AOC understood what it had become. It was no longer just a record, it was a tombstone. She picked it up not to read from it again, but to hold it in full view. This, she said, her tone slow and measured, is not just a memo. She turned slightly, looking toward Tom Homan, her gaze steady. You didn't just sign a document, you signed a legacy. He didn't flinch, but his hands, folded neatly just moments earlier, had shifted. Now they pressed flat against the table, tense, as if bracing for impact. When historians look back at this chapter, AOC continued, they won't start with the laws. They won't open with the budget justifications or the legal frameworks. They'll start with the stories, the letters, the names we tried to speak here today. She gestured to the folder of testimonies. Gabriela, Luz Maria, Maria Isabel. Her voice remained level, but behind it ran something deeper. Grief sharpened into resolve. They will ask who gave permission, who turned principle into paperwork, who traded humanity for protocol. She placed the memo back on the desk next to the photograph. And when they do, Mr. Homan, your name will be there. He looked at her now, not defiant, but heavy with the recognition that comes when rhetoric ends and record begins. AOC didn't press further. She simply looked down once more at the memo and said almost quietly, ink doesn't fade from memory just because it fades from paper. Across the room, the air was still. Members of the committee sat rigid, as if waiting for someone to interrupt the moment, to cut in with procedure or platitude. But none came. And then, as if spoken from somewhere just outside the hearing walls, the narrator's voice returned. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady and clear. Some memos stay on paper, others bleed into history. Some policies pass through departments, others pass through the lives of people who were never meant to survive them. This memo was not filed away. It was lived, and the names it affected were never printed on the final page. Back at the table, AOC closed the folder, gently and deliberately. She didn't need to say anything else. The record had already spoken. Tom Homan sat still, no longer responding, no longer reaching for justification, because no justification, however carefully worded, could erase what had just been etched into the public memory, not in bold headlines, but in the quiet truth of a child's photo next to a man's signature. And that, more than any argument, was the legacy that would last. The room was no longer tense in the way it had been earlier. The heat of confrontation had cooled into something quieter, heavier, like the silence after a funeral, when grief settles into the body and clarity takes its place. The memo had been read. The child's name had been spoken. The questions had been asked, and most had not been answered. But now came the part that mattered most, the part that lingered long after hearings adjourned and cameras were turned off. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. The evidence had spoken. The silence had testified. And what she carried now was not accusation. It was responsibility. She straightened the stack of papers in front of her, folded her hands gently, and looked straight ahead. Not at Tom Homan, not even at the committee members, but past them, toward the record, the country, and the history that was quietly being written. We have spent hours in this hearing examining a policy that was defended, executed, and later disowned, she began. A policy that stripped children from the arms of their parents, that turned legal asylum seekers into detainees, that allowed infants to die without records and mothers to grieve without names. Her voice didn't shake. It didn't waver. It simply moved forward, slow, deliberate, like the toll of a bell. We are often told that these things happen in systems, that they are unfortunate, unintended consequences of tough decisions made under pressure. But what we've shown today is that these weren't accidents. They were options, chosen, signed, defended. She let that hang, then continued. We are not judged by how we treat the powerful. We are judged by how we treat the vulnerable. And by that measure, this policy failed not only our laws, not only our values, but our basic sense of humanity. For the first time, even some of her critics on the committee were no longer looking for rebuttals. A few sat quietly, pens in hand, but unmoving. The performance had ended. This was something else now. I am calling today, AOC said, for a full congressional investigation into the design, implementation, and aftermath of the family separation policy. I am calling for subpoena power to access the documents that have been hidden, to hear from the voices that have been ignored, and to uncover the decisions made behind closed doors that led to open wounds. She picked up the photo of Maria Isabel one last time, holding it with both hands. I am calling for a federal reparations program for families who were separated under this policy, funded not only to support their reunification, but to provide the counseling, housing, and legal aid that might help them rebuild some fraction of what was taken. She paused. Not for effect, but because there were no easy words to follow that kind of request. Because the truth is, no policy will bring Maria Isabel back. No memo can undo her death. But what we can do, what we must do, is make sure that what happened to her, to lose Maria, to thousands of others, never ever happens again. She placed the photo gently back on the desk. And if we fail to act now, then we are not just preserving a broken system, we are endorsing it. Then finally she looked back at Tom Homan, not with hatred, not even anger, but something more unnerving. Resolve. This country can choose to be better, but it must first choose to admit the harm it has caused. And with that, the reckoning began. Not in shouting, not in applause, but in the silence that followed her words, steady, undeniable, and filled with the burden of truth. He didn't stand immediately. For a few seconds after the gavel tapped and the hearing was formally adjourned, Tom Homan remained seated. His hands were folded, his lips pressed together in a line that once might have looked firm, but now simply appeared clenched. Around him, aides gathered papers, committee members whispered to one another, and staffers began to exit in twos and threes. Yet Homan sat there, eyes on the table, the folded memo still lying in front of him like a wound someone had reopened. He didn't look at AOC. He didn't look at the audience. And for the first time all day, no cameras trailed his every movement. His moment in the spotlight had come and gone. Not with defiance, not with a soundbite, but with a silence that had grown too loud to ignore. Eventually he rose. There was no applause, no reporters swarmed to hear his spin. The press pool had already begun packing up. The room, once thick with tension, now hung heavy with something else. Finality. Homan moved toward the rear exit, not the main aisle where he'd strutted in hours earlier, chin high, posture bold, but a side door, plain and unmarked. His pace was steady, but his shoulders had dropped, his steps slower, almost mechanical. Someone opened the door for him. He nodded, no words, no bravado. As the latch clicked shut behind him, the camera of memory, if not of media, drifted back for a moment, tracing the symmetry of the day. His arrival had been calculated, confident. He'd walked in like a man defending policy, sure of his record, certain of his message. Every inch of his body had seemed to say, I've done this before. I know how this ends. But he hadn't known. Not this ending. Not this stillness. Earlier, his voice had filled the room with abstractions: deterrence, legality, order. Now the only sound left was the slow rustle of chairs being pushed back, of people breathing out as if they'd been holding air for hours. Homan had entered believing he would make his case. Instead, he had become the case. And that's when the narrator returned, not to offer judgment, but to speak what no one in the room dared to say aloud. Justice doesn't always arrive with handcuffs. Sometimes it arrives with silence. Sometimes it doesn't need a verdict to be felt. Sometimes it comes in the weight of your own footsteps echoing in an empty hallway. Not every reckoning is televised. Some follow you out of the room. Tom Homan didn't look back. He didn't take questions. He didn't issue a final statement. He didn't offer a rebuttal, because there was nothing left to rebut. What had happened in that room wasn't just a hearing. It was a reckoning etched into the public memory. And as he disappeared down the corridor, the last trace of him was not his defense, but his exit. Quiet, pale, wordless. And that, more than any declaration or denial, told the country exactly what it needed to know. The sun had lowered just slightly by the time Alexandria Ocasio-cortez stepped through the doors of the Capitol. The air was different now, not heavy like the hearing room, but charged, electric, waiting. The moment her foot touched the top step outside, a wave of flashing lights met her. Journalists swarmed like bees, voices layered on top of each other, cameras snapping, microphones thrust toward her face. They didn't shout insults. They didn't frame the question. They simply asked breathlessly, "Congresswoman, what now?" She could have given them a full press statement, could have summarized the hours of testimony, the emotional weight of Luz Maria's letter, the photo of Maria Isabel, the way silence had followed Tom Homan out of the room like a shadow. But she didn't. She looked straight ahead, steady and calm, just as she had all day, and said only this: "We owe them more than outrage. We owe them justice." No elaboration, no slogan, just a single sentence that pierced through the clamor like glass breaking. The crowd quieted. The reporters knew. This wasn't the end of a hearing. It was the start of something else. And then came the images, not as spectacle, but as memory stitched forward. A woman in a blue dress kneeling at the edge of a tarmac, arms outstretched as her son, aged 10 now, but last seen at 5, ran into her arms, sobbing, face buried in her shoulder. A crowd of citizens outside a federal courthouse in El Paso, holding signs that read, "We remember their names." A congressman previously silent on immigration, co-signing the introduction of a new bill titled the Family Justice and Reparations Act. In another scene, a former ICE staffer walked into a hearing room to give voluntary testimony, no longer willing to stay quiet. And in a small town in Arizona, a local school held a community night where a former detainee, now reunited with her daughter, read aloud from the children's book she had written, titled The Day Mama Came Back. The stories didn't fade. They multiplied. Justice didn't come all at once, but piece by piece, through interviews, through legislation, through the courage of those who had once been silenced, finding their voices in rooms that had once excluded them. Inside the Capitol, the memo remained in the official record. Black ink on government letterhead, marked, archived, undeniable. But now it sat beside something else. A growing movement, a public reckoning, a future reckoned in names, not numbers. And finally the narrator returned. Not to summarize, not to editorialize, but to close the loop. Some moments are remembered because they were televised, others because they were survived. Some documents change policy, others change people. History is written in ink, but justice is written in courage. And with that, the story passed from paper to people, from outrage to action, from silence to something louder, more enduring. Truth carried forward, one name at a time. The hearing was over. The work was just beginning. If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Alexandria Rising Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Alexandria Rising Stories.